can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, both in the room, but also welcome to our online folks out there. I want to invite you as well to this wonderful event today. Before we get started with today's event, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Our work here, no matter how noble its intention and purposes in this moment, relies on stolen land. To acknowledge this is not a sufficient reparative act. And I'm particularly excited about today's event because this is the first joint event of the Mellon Grant Communities of Care working with the Gender Institute. So I'm wearing both my hats as both Gender Institute Director as well as my PI hat for the Communities of Care grant. So this is very exciting. It also means I get to thank more people before I get started and introduce our speakers today. From the Gender Institute, I want to thank Megan Vaughn and Sarabi Pant, who've done so much to make this happen today. And from the Communities of Care team, Laurel Payne and Izzy Fernando as well. So thank you all for helping pull this together. And this is a great kind of synergy between the grant, which looks at both care workers and caregivers in terms of things thinking about labor, as well as disability studies and those who receive care. So this is a really nice way to bring some of those themes into here at UB. So we're here today to talk about the new book, Transforming School Food Politics Around the World, with editors and authors Jen Gaddis and Sarah Robert. They take a practice that we generally take for granted, a kind of ubiquitous practice that is school food programs, feeding children in schools, and demonstrate how it reveals ethics of care and labor, as well as a feminized politics of resistance. And it's a great reminder, actually, that resistance begins where we are. And that includes, of course, school cafeterias. So before I turn it over to them, let me just do a brief introduction of both of them. Dr. Jennifer Gaddis is an associate professor of civil society and community studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the author of the 2019 book, The Labor of Lunch. A great title, Why We Need Real Food and Real Jobs in American Public Schools, which won book awards from the National Women's Studies Association and the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Dr. Gaddis' scholarship on the intersection of care and school food has been published in multiple journals, including Feminist Economics, Agricultural and Human Values, and Radical Teacher. Gaddis is an advisory board member of the National Farm to School Network and has written op-eds on school food politics for popular media outlets as well. She and her students regularly partner with school districts, labor unions, and social movement organizations on community-based research and advocacy projects related to food justice in K through 12 schools. Dr. Sarah Robert is an associate professor at the University at Buffalo and an interdisciplinary expert in global education politics, global gender policies, and school food politics. Of particular interest in her ethnographic studies is how policy and politics shape and are shaped by the intersectional qualities of gender and other context-specific dynamics. Dr. Robert is the author of the award-winning books Neoliberal Education Reform, Gendered Notions in Global and Local Contexts, 2017, and School Food Politics, 2011. She is a transnational scholar trained in Latin America and has also done additional edited special issues for global audiences as well. She's also written extensively for transdisciplinary academic and popular audiences in multiple languages. Currently, she leads a multinational research team comparing government and teacher responses to COVID-19 in Argentina, Chile, the UK, and the US. So if I have some questions, I'm going to ask our panelists, but I want them to kind of start first to talk a little bit about where this book project came from and maybe just to get us started. So I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and also to all of you for being here today and to those of you who helped put on the event. I'm really delighted to be here because I get to visit one of my best friends and collaborators in the academic world, Sarah Robert, who just came to Madison earlier this semester to visit me. So it's nice to have this institutional exchange. Before we came to Buffalo, we actually did a similar talk at Yale a couple days ago. And I got to tell people there that it was really fun for me as a graduate student at Yale to read Sarah's first book on school food, which was School Food Politics, as a graduate student. And then several years later, when I was a faculty member at Wisconsin, to get to meet Sarah, who was one of my academic idols at that point in time because of the way that she looked at school food, really through this lens of politics and not just through the lens of nutrition or looking specifically at plate waste or supply chains, but more about sort of these complex dynamics about how and why these programs look the way that they do and how they reflect different kinds of human values and struggles. So I was really excited when Sarah asked me if I would want to edit with her a new version of this book. And we launched this project, and it's been a really wonderful opportunity to learn from people all over the world who really see the potential for school meal programs to be a really important public source of care. So we talk in the book quite a bit about this idea of care infrastructure and how we can think about school meals really as this intersection of not only education and food infrastructure, but also care infrastructure when we design these programs to really be careful. So I'll pass things over to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for beginning us with
Sure.
such a strong beginning and a broad beginning and a historical one too. My own foray and dive into school food was actually at the urging of educators. I was in the process of conducting an ethnography with teachers about the way that their work was changing as a result of neoliberal reform in Argentina. And they kept telling me, just come and see our work, come and see our work. And part of finally understanding that coming to see their work involved rethinking all of the work that teachers do on a day-to-day basis in schools and with school communities in that particular context, but obviously around the world. And one of those pieces of work that was so fundamental to them being able to do the job that they wanted to fulfill the passion that led them to the classroom was that they had to address the care needs of the students and also their families. Part of that care work was actually feeding students, yet the programs in Argentina, the national policy didn't include secondary students. It stopped at the elementary level. And here I am in high schools, and the teachers are telling me that they had to feed their students as well in order for the students to show up for school, in order that they could teach, for example, history. So it was really through their introduction into rethinking all of the work that is done within our school communities and within our school buildings that led me to rethink both teachers' work, but also school work and the politics around who feeds whom, what, how, and why, or for what purpose in schools, and to reconsider the roles that different stakeholders can and do play within those institutions that we're perhaps not paying attention to, but definitely should be, because one of the things I learned by following the teachers around for a couple of years is how much they were engaged in politics, or this thing that I just referred to when I'm thinking about politics is the struggles over finite material and symbolic resources. And they were in a struggle with both provincial government and the national government to acknowledge the need to change the national school food program and to specifically address it within their school, and very quickly, because they wanted to, and they knew that there was a need for the students to actually be fed at school as well. So yeah, I guess that's a good intro to how this all started.
Absolutely, and you both use the term politics, so I would love to talk a little bit more about that, partly because when people think about a school cafeteria or providing a service to students, they don't necessarily think about this as a political, act or something involved in politics. But you use terms like the capitalism and patriarchy, imperialism and colonialism when you're talking about this particular project. So if you could say a little bit more about why this is political and maybe even what does politics mean in this context, that would be really helpful, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I gave that kind of brief definition of what I think of as politics and what I'm looking for and what I'm hoping to learn from different school-based stakeholders when I'm thinking about politics and trying to understand it. But if I pull back a little further, the teachers in Argentina, the teachers here in Buffalo, the teachers that I've met around the world who are involved in feeding their students are engaged in this very political act of feeding students in order for them to have access to educational opportunity, in order for them to come to school, to stay in school, and to be able to learn well while they're in school. And to me, it's also just an acknowledgement of, in calling that a politics, it's an acknowledgement of the need for our schools and national governments to acknowledge the incredible role that our schools already are playing. And I guess I would say I think of it as a political act because they're acting to care for students. They're acting as caregivers, and students are receiving care within this state institution. And I should say our book actually focuses on public education. We don't delve into private education or independent schools.
Great. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of times when people think about school food politics in particular, the most kind of visible clashes tend to be between really the government, so infighting between different groups that are deciding, for example, should school meals be free for all students or should it be a means-tested entitlement program? So that's like a current political debate that we have here in the United States. And also these kind of political clashes between, for example, when new nutritional regulations are set, there might be corporate lobbyists from big food companies that really want to push back against what some of those regulatory standards look like. So I think that's what a lot of times people think about when they first think about school food politics. It's these powerful actors of government and lobbyists. And what Sarah and I are really trying to do in this volume to say, sure, that's one form of school food politics, but that's a really limited form. We also have to recognize all the work of different social movements that, for example, in South Korea, were really, really active in pushing their government in 2011 to reform their existing program to create a universal, free, eco-friendly school meal program. So not only do we see this work of social movements in terms of kind of pushing governments to take different kinds of responsibilities and to sort of reshape or rethink the purposes of school meals, but we also see politics in really the everyday actions of, for example, young people can refuse the care that the state is providing for them, right, by choosing to throw away the food or to not eat what's available to them in the first place. So one of the things that I really love about school food is that we can see so many different dimensions of politics, from the very individual kind of micro level to thinking about really these huge, powerful structures and questions about what an economy is for. Like what is it that government food subsidies should be used to accomplish when it comes to supporting particular kinds of food systems. So all of those things, I think, are political questions about the design of school meal programs. And through the different contributors to this volume, we see a lot of different entry points that people can take based on their positionality. So if they're, for example, a woman farmer in Argentina, or if they're a high school student in Philadelphia, or if they're a teacher in British Columbia in the teachers union, or we actually have two examples of practitioner chapters from California and Vermont that were two of the states in the United States that led the first successful campaigns for universal free school meals. So we see so many different examples of people coming together from different sort of stakeholder positionalities and different definitions of what the problem is that they see in their communities and from their positionality with respect to school food, and learning how to navigate these systems and make change within them. So I think that's the kind of way that we're trying to get people to think about school food politics, is not something that happens outside of them and that they're a passive recipient of, but as something that they can be actively invited to participate in as part of a broader kind of democratic discussion and mobilization around how we want to shape the world around us.
Yeah, and I would actually say one of the things we also try to do is to point out that politics is done on different scales. So to kind of speak back to that idea that policy is done over there in the distance, but what we've tried to do is provide cases throughout the book that show how politics that really do have an impact on what is happening in a school food system are actually happening at different scales throughout levels of governance and national contexts.
Yeah, the question of scale is definitely relevant. So I want to pull out some of the politics, and actually, as a follow-up, I mean, you mentioned the sort of eco-friendly, and I hadn't really been thinking about this, but the sort of climate change, the environment, in what ways do those issues, impact your discussion? And that probably varies depending on what region of the world that you're talking about. But
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that we did try to highlight in choosing some of the particular case studies was examples of countries that are really leaders in trying to use public policy to support a transition in their agriculture and food systems towards sustainability. So a couple of the examples in the book that I would say fit that definition are South Korea, Brazil, Japan, and Finland, and even the state of California, actually, within the United States. So we have some examples that show kind of how that looks on a practical level. But one thing that's been interesting is that since this book came out last May, Sarah and I have been able to be part of some additional conversations with people who have read our work and then said, we want to talk with you about it. And we had heard about the Global School Meals Coalition, which is something that really was created during the pandemic from the United Nations and a whole bunch of different member nations and philanthropists and others in this multi-sector sort of coalition. And one of the leaders within that is the Rockefeller Foundation, and they have been putting a lot of time and attention into building out what they're talking about as this sort of agenda for supporting regenerative school meals, so regenerative agriculture through public school meal programs. And I remember seeing a statistic from the United Nations World Food Program on World Food Day, and that statistic said that 70% of public food programs globally are actually school feeding programs. So when we think about kind of where public dollars currently rest within the food system, a lot of that is currently directed towards schools. And I think that with increased discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals, there's been a lot of discussion about developing new school meal programs in places where they don't exist, or expanding the reach of them in countries where maybe they have them, but only for a limited number of people. And as part of that conversation, I think what we're really seeing is this emphasis on not just meeting the really basic needs of children for calories or nutrients, but also thinking more holistically about how can we use these public resources, so these public dollars that go toward paying for these programs, in ways that are also supporting other goals like climate change adaptation and mitigation through the kinds of foods that we're actually producing for these meal programs.
Yeah. And I think the reason those changes are coming about is, and we try to emphasize in the book, is to show how school food isn't just about a cafeteria tray, but rather has tendrils that reach deep and broadly into different systems. It's interwoven. When I think of the case of Uruguay in South America, for example, if we're going to sit down and have a conversation about changes that are taking place in our school meal programs there, we're sitting down with someone who's from agriculture, we're sitting down from someone from public health, someone from education. So they're acknowledging that school food is a system, and a system that has significant potential for changing the society in which those changes are being proposed, much more than what I would have seen, what I did see when I published the first book on school food politics in 2011, which was really this limited idea that we should serve students in schools. That was already a given. There was no question of should we do it. It was how are we going to do it? And it was specifically thinking about high nutrition biscuits and other food that was focused on nutritional needs for very, in some national contexts, limited populations within them. Now that has been broadened, and I feel really fortunate that the book is coming out and contributing to this conversation about how we can use schools, but also think about school food in particular in ways that can be regenerative, not only of agriculture, but about the whole purpose of the public school project itself.
Great. Yeah, and another thing, another sort of, piece of politics that you're very much, helping to talk about, launching this conversation, is the question of care work and its relationship to feminism. And it's incredibly impressive that your foreword of your book is by Silvia Federici, who of course is the pioneering scholar of care work and feminism and care. So what is the relationship between school, food, politics, and feminism, would you say? And, and maybe you could tell the story of how she wrote the foreword too.
So UB alumni, I just had to put that out there, and she was so delighted to speak with us, and noted that she was a UB alumni when she did that. Again, this project started 4 years ago, and it was during the pandemic, and during that time, we just found, as we were learning from the case studies and the people who were contributing to it, that that care work needed to be central in our conversation. And we both entered into this project already having a feminist and gender studies concern for care work and labor, broadly speaking, and policy in particular. And I actually approached Jen because I think it's on a website or something where I'm talking about who I am as a scholar, and as a scholar I consider myself an education policy researcher, but specifically concerned about the relationship of gender and education policy. And yet when I produced that first book, the gender part kind of fell out, and I was really pushing for first a broader acknowledgement of school food and school food politics, but that gender piece kind of fell to the wayside. And then Jen's book came out, and I read it, and I thought, well, she's doing what I didn't pull off in that first book, and now it's almost 10 years, and I know that there needs to be a concern for gender dynamics if we're going to actually transform school food, because of the nature of the care work that is feeding students in our schools, and just work in schools in general. That's more of it's not so much answering your question, but to give us give a feel for how this started to evolve, and we really ended up foregrounding the relationship of gender and school food politics in the book.
Did you want to follow?
Yeah, I'll add some more to that. So when we were thinking about who would make a good choice for the foreword, I think that Silvia Federici was top of mind for me because I had read an essay of hers many years ago that really stuck in my mind. So it was an essay from a book called Revolution at Point Zero, where she makes this point that it's a really different thing when a community comes together and through self-determination decides like what sort of food system or what sort of way of eating makes sense for them, and then demands that a government or a state pay for it, versus if a state just kind of comes up with it and is just like, here, take this. And so I think that the way that she described that difference, but also how she really has been so centrally focused not only on care and social reproduction, but also on thinking about agriculture. I think that for me, it felt like she would be just such a wonderful person to be in conversation with, and to help introduce school food politics to maybe an audience that didn't really think about school food, but really cared about care and social reproduction or feminist theory, or just
and vice versa,
feminist political economy. Yeah.
And vice versa, a population education policy or nutritionists, you name it, who are not thinking about her work and the very significant social reproduction that takes place around educational institutions.
So I think that piece about social reproduction, like to me, that kind of is one of the most central feminist concerns about school food programs, is really that it is this sort of clash in terms of who's going to take responsibility for the concrete care needs of a population. Is it a private responsibility that is sort of shoved off into the home? Is it something that's collectivized? Like, what does that actually look like? So I think those are really important conversations to look at in terms of thinking about what even like a feminist food system could look like, is those questions around collective care and thinking about communal feeding and different examples that we've seen throughout history or over different contexts, what that has looked like. And I think that school food is a place where we can look at really important cultural differences of how that care is either expressed or really not expressed through everyday actions. And so I think to me it was really important to be thinking about this through multiple different kind of angles. So for example, there's this concept in food studies that people talk about as like care at a distance, which is basically this idea that there's so much separation between people who actually produce food and people who consume it usually, that the only way as a consumer that you can really express care is if you have some way to mediate that distance. And so we see different examples of, for example, the Good Food Purchasing Program, which I know is something that they have here in Buffalo, but also other examples like how they have developed kind of their own standards and own requirements in Brazil and South Korea for how they're trying to actually say, okay, we really want to make sure that when we're sourcing food for schools, it's coming from these supply chains that are like more ethical and where we know people are treated fairly in terms of labor, where we know the environmental conditions are better or animal welfare is better. So I think that there's kind of that piece of kind of bringing in some of those concerns, as well as thinking about who the core workforce is. So, for example, like my specialty is really the United States. Like that's where I focus most of my work. And here, 93% of the school food workforce is people who identify as women. And globally speaking, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's still a very, very highly gendered workforce. And a lot of the studies that have tried to kind of capture what this workforce looks like as a whole have really revealed two things. One, that it is very gendered, and two, that pretty much universally speaking, that labor tends to be low wage. Like there's a care penalty associated with it when you think about how that work is actually compensated, and that in many, many places, a lot of that work is actually unpaid. And not even just in majority world countries, but even in Canada, which just created a national school lunch program this past summer. In July, yeah, there were a lot of people who were working just in volunteer capacity in their school meal program. And I think that one of the things that I did in my first book, The Labor of Lunch, was to try to ask, well, with the early origins of these programs, like why was there always this expectation that this work be provided for free, or if not free, to be very cheap? And I think one of the tensions that we saw historically in the United States that we see play out in a number of countries, some of which we feature in the book now, is that there's often this sort of pitting of the needs of the receivers of care versus the givers of care, and saying a lot of times there's this kind of false dichotomy of, okay, we only have like so much in terms of financial resources. Do we want to spend more on giving access to food for more children, or ensuring that the people who are working in these programs are actually compensated fairly? And so those two things have, I think, historically in the United States been really put in tension, and is something that across a lot of these countries that are starting to build out or expand their programs, we're seeing as, I think, a real point of tension as well.
Mm-hmm. I would say too, adding on to this concern for elevating awareness around the social reproduction that does happen in schools generally, and specifically with school food, is this real need to think about schools in a different way altogether, as and really to acknowledge what's already happening in those schools, whether it is visible, whether it is compensated for justly at all. And it is that schools and school workers, from cafeteria workers to teachers, are actually caring for students in schools. And this social reproductive role is not prioritized in our public education system. It's fallen to the wayside, I would say, or maybe always has been to the wayside in terms of public education in the United States. But when we started talking to Silvia Federici, it was so heartening to hear her talk about, like, oh, of course, social reproduction matters in terms of schools and school food and the meals provided. And it reminded me of the fact that we have a need to transform schools and public schools generally, and the public school project in national context significantly to acknowledge and to value and to compensate for that social reproductive work that they are doing for societies. And I would say I'm reminded of what a principal in an Argentinian high school in a marginalized community on the outskirts of the capital said to me, and this is in the late 90s, early 2000s, he said, Sarah, this public school is the last remnant of the state that people can actually reach out to for help, for care, and to be acknowledged as being a part of a society. And so I think back, there's a connection there in what he's saying, in that he knew what his school was doing, but that social reproductive role that he was providing and the teachers in the school were providing just wasn't a part of the productive role that is often prioritized and talked about in terms of what schools are supposed to do.
Yeah, and this is so resonant historically. And
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about the turn of the last century and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's a problematic thinker in all sorts of ways, but advocated for apartment buildings with communal kitchens.
Yes.
And a big part of her economic plan for the liberation of women and for feminism was about taking the production of food outside of the private home or the private space, the women's labor, and making it public. So there seems to be a real resonance there historically, but also a resonance historically in terms of the pushback. And the ways in which this is women's labor that maybe ideally should be done in the home, and that women should be packing up their children's lunches with loving care in bento boxes, and So is that part of the dynamic when there is pushback to making these programs universal, et cetera, that this is labor that should be done in the home and not in the school?
I mean, there's tensions that go in both directions. And here I'm really thinking about the two examples of one of the Canadian contributors who talked from the Canadian context about how the passage of the first ever Canadian school meal program would actually release mothers specifically from this additional labor in implementing this or rolling out this plan. And then I was thinking about, I don't remember if it was Japan or South Korea, who also talked about how, because it was Japan, that they were emphasizing culturally relevant food, so they were really trying to elevate and prioritize the Japanese foodways and traditions in the school meal. And what that meant for mothers, and we know from studies of feminist studies of Japan and women's labor, the intensity of that social reproductive work and the expectations that are attached to it. Well, with the passage and then the continued funding of the Japanese model of school meals, what that meant was that the mothers could rely on a healthy, fresh, and culturally relevant meal for their students in school, which lessened the expectation, burden, just plain old labor of producing a similar meal in the home during the rest of the meal times that they were responsible for.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if she is on line, but
Oh, that's right.
if Katsura Mori is on there, she's actually a professor at the University of Yamagata, and
Yeah.
I visited her right before the pandemic in summer of 2019 in Japan for a month, and she actually organized interviews, and I got to hear from a lot of these mothers directly that were very much saying that, and she took me around to eat a lot of different school meals, and it was so fun. The meals were really delicious, and I think that we invited her along with a collaborator to contribute a chapter about Japan, because I think that theirs is a really interesting example for a few reasons. So one, they have a really long-standing program. So I think it's important to look at some of these programs that started kind of in the wake of World War II, and to show that they actually can go pretty fundamental transformations. So in 2009 in Japan, there was a real significant change to their National School Lunch Act that not only emphasized some of these dimensions that Sarah was talking about, but also included things like really intentionally through food education, cultivating a respect for labor of people across the food chain whose work had gone into feeding the children, as well as a respect for nature through school meals. And so to see that kind of language actually codified in a national school lunch law as what this is supposed to be accomplishing, I think is quite different when we think about the caring potential of school meals. And one of the things that really struck me when I was there, and you can see pictures of this and kind of descriptions of it in the chapter in the book, or if you look online, is how in Japanese schools, the children themselves are actually involved in the labor of school meals. So they have a chore wheel, and they all take turns doing things like preparing the space, getting the food, dishing it out, cleaning up afterwards. And I think that that is something that, to me, was really interesting as an outsider and as someone who's not an expert in Japan, to look at and to see, like, wow, that's interesting, because like they're involving young people across all genders, across all, class, like any, of those potential lines of difference in terms of who typically would be, at least in the US context, assigned to doing care work versus not. Like everyone's doing it in this shared space. And so that's one of the things that I thought was really especially interesting, like when I had a chance to talk to some of these mothers, is that they felt school meals, especially because they were so high quality and really fulfilled a lot of the things that they wanted them to accomplish, that they felt like they had kind of permission to do less sophisticated culinary labor of their own, but it was still them who was doing it. That it wasn't like, these boys became men who then were doing the majority of food work in the home. And it was really interesting to kind of point that out and like have this conversation with them about like, well, why is it so actually different in the school context versus like once people leave that space? So.
Oh, that is fascinating. Yeah, the power of the domestic space. So I want to ask also about agency and how things change, whether it's, mostly for the good or for the bad. But the kind of question of agency and power, I mean, I think when you think about, well, at least in the US context, when you think about a school system, I'm sure this is true elsewhere, it's big, it's bureaucratic, there's very large unions in some cases, which, can be very good things, but also involve bureaucracy. And that people can feel sort of powerless in facing this big institution. So in these case studies, what kinds of agency were people able to operate? Maybe children as well as parents and just ordinary people to kind of challenge this large bureaucratic, sometimes the biggest one of any community.
Yeah. There's, throughout the chapters, agency is exerted in school food politics in really different ways, and it isn't necessarily, I think we're trying to unsettle the idea that agency and acting as a policy protagonist, as we suggest, doesn't involve going to a state capitol building or a national capitol building and picketing or demanding something, but rather there are acts of transformative agency that are waged even in the act of feeding students within, for example, the Peruvian chapter, which is in the Peruvian Amazon, where there's an expectation that mothers are actually preparing the meals for the community, though the resources to do so are provided, the diet and the menu is set. But those mothers also have very different ideas about what foodways matter and how who's providing the food, what is being served even. And so they would use, for example, if a youth came to school with a fish that they caught that morning or with game that they had caught, they would acknowledge that, make sure that that act of continuing to source their food from the area around where the community lives, where their territory, and would prepare it in a traditional way, even though that wasn't part of the national menu. And what we see is that they aren't traveling to Lima to protest the menu that's set, but they're using the power and that they have as members of that community and membership in that community to actually change how the students are being fed and to ensure that their goals and dreams for their students are being met in the school meal that they're providing. That's one example I can think of.
Fascinating example.
Yeah, and it's very different example from some of the other examples where we see people in California or Vermont engaging with state level officials to change school meals.
Right. You mentioned youth though specifically, so I would highlight 2 chapters. So one of the chapters was a chapter that was contributed by a number of different people who are involved in the Canadian Healthy School Meals Coalition. And they were really active in actually getting this program. And so they wrote a chapter in collaboration with several academics who work on this issue. And one of the academics is the late Seneca Elliott, who is a sociologist who I think because so much of her focus was on youth, she really made it hammered home in that chapter that we have to think about youth as competent social actors and actually be much more participatory in terms of how we think about designing systems that center youth and that treat them as if they are really capable of actually making good decisions instead of just treating them as if they're the future that we're feeding versus this active present that we can engage with. So I think that chapter is really helpful in terms of just reminding us to be treating young people with more respect in terms of engaging with them about thinking about what school food should look like. And then we have another chapter that was actually contributed by a young person, Raven, who at the time when she wrote it was
in high school.
A senior in high school at Philadelphia Public Schools.
Yeah.
And I think that hers is just an example of what this kind of agency can look like, and that she was a member of an organization called Rebel Ventures, and that organization came out of at first a middle school, and then it became like a high school organization as some of these kids got older. But basically, they felt like their school system in Philadelphia, which was providing free meals for all, just didn't really meet the students' needs in terms of quality and taste preference. And they came up with, I think, a really interesting slogan or concept that guides their work called Healthy Deliciousness, which is this idea that food should be both good for you and good to you. And they designed several different products that first they just kind of made as like a cottage industry thing that they would sell, like some breakfast bars and things like that complied with the national regulations. And then eventually they were able to actually scale up their business to where they at first did kind of larger production themselves, and then eventually for at least one of the products contracted with a local bakery to follow their recipe while they worked on some other items. And the city, like the school district of Philadelphia, now purchases those products for use in its school breakfast program. So it's like a student designed project, student designed recipe, and they did a lot of work as well during the pandemic, particularly during school closures, to their school administration reached out to them, and they were basically like, we need your help actually talking to your peers about how to access food that we have available right now, and how to also help them understand like that the food may look a little different right now in terms of how we're distributing it, and that they may want to do different things with it at home. So they created a lot of like little like video tutorials and things like that that showed people like how to prepare meals with the ingredients that the school district was providing. And I think that that's just an example of like how they recognized that the current system wasn't really working for them, and started to try to develop like some alternatives, while at the same time trying to work for kind of larger term systemic change over what the actual meals look like that the school district is providing. So yeah.
Now I'm thinking about how many of the chapters actually do touch on youth.
The Finnish one.
I was
Do you
thinking
wanna
of the
mention
Finnish
that
one. Yeah. So there's a chapter from the Finnish context as well. And what we learned from this, the particular case study, is how they have a food program that involves students in learning about raising awareness and being involved in civic engagement around school food, setting school meal menus, making decisions about school meal spaces, that reflects much more than just setting a menu, but rather behind it is this very strategic role or goal of cultivating democratic members of society who know how to participate, and understanding that democratic participation in a society happens at very different scales, and yes, can involve youth, and can kind of lay the groundwork for future involvement in civil society.
And
go ahead.
I was just going to mention in that chapter in particular, the authors kind of chart out what like these action learning cycles can look like that involve youth, and specifically these collaborations between youth, the home economics department, because they actually require home economics instruction in Finland, and the like cafeteria staff, they call them caterers there. So that could actually be like a collaborative space for people to come together and think about, in particular, this goal of what a sustainable food service would look like. So their chapter really centers around this concept of sustainability, but in particular, how you could bring these three different groups together to really think about concretely what that would look like across different contexts that people might engage in.
So it's not pushed down from a different political level, so to speak,
Right.
but is actually being generated at the level of the school community. I was thinking also about the example from North Carolina, and how in this particular context, in one North Carolina school district, they were seeking to, there was a need for summer feeding programs, but there was really no way to ensure that in this very broad or distance-wise school district, that those food programs could reach students and their families during the summer. And so what that led to when they started brainstorming and involving different stakeholder groups in the school food program was transportation employees, collaborating with school nutrition specialists, with teachers, with administrators, to come up with something they call the Yum Yum Bus, which is pretty fun, and that served the need of ensuring that students and their families had access to nutrition during the summer, and it evolved into resources from school, books, and other materials and information, kind of reaching the community, this rural and dispersed community.
You know, it's interesting just thinking about social movements in the 20th century, how feeding children has often been part of it, right? So the Black Panther breakfast program, the welfare rights movement did a huge amount around feeding children. So there is the agency question, there is a kind of a longer history of that. I want to ask you a little bit more about methodology, which probably differed, or did differ from the different case studies. But you do talk about this idea of kind of taking seriously embodied knowledge and lived experience as opposed to the sort of traditional archive. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by embodied knowledge and maybe how that relates to methodological approaches to this sort of study.
The first thing that pops to my mind when I'm thinking about this is, so I'm an ethnographer, so I spend a lot of time observing and being with humans in educational settings. But we don't have one specific methodology for the whole book, but there are many different methodologies that are used. And in particular, there's a real emphasis on prioritizing and valuing the stories and the storytelling that people engage in around meals and around food. And that we are trying to prioritize and raise awareness about the value, but the power of those stories for understanding different communities' approaches to engaging in that communal shared meal, but also how we can use that in different ways to tell a different story about what different communities want out of their school meals in particular.
Yeah, I would also say one of the things I really liked about Sarah's first book, School Food Politics, was that it had really diverse authorship in terms of not only having academics, but also some practitioners. And that was something that I think we really wanted in the second volume as well, is making sure that people who don't always have the space or support to tell their own stories are supported in doing that. So one of the things that I think made the book sometimes a challenging process, but ultimately a very rewarding one, was working with groups that maybe were entirely academics or like a group of academics and getting them to write in a way that would be really understandable for a broad audience while still kind of keeping the core of what they found important to say, while at the same time kind of taking the draft writing of people who maybe would be used to writing in a much shorter form and asking like critical questions and helping to kind of draw out more of their stories onto the page. So the fact that we ended up with having people who are involved in the work of actually leading some of these successful coalitions, like in Vermont and California, or people who are involved in creating the Yum Yum Bus in North Carolina, or some of these other examples of people who were doing that on the groundwork versus researchers who were maybe documenting it, felt really important to me as a way to make sure that more people feel like there's space and sort of a method that they can look to for telling some of their own stories about school food politics and systems change.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about how we put that together as being somewhat methodological in our approach. So thanks for bringing that.
But then we had certain chapters where, like, if it was like a very kind of traditional academic thing, like figuring out how to let them talk about their methods and do certain things in a way that didn't seem
The
totally
challenges
out
of an
place.
edited collection, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, familiar with that. But I mean, so I'm only going to ask another couple questions and we can open it up. But that kind of brings into the question of this comparative approach, right? And transnational, and that is a really interesting choice in and of itself. So maybe you could speak a little bit to the benefits of having that kind of comparative transnational global approach, and perhaps maybe some of the challenges as well. And I kind of want to ask like what country wins, but I know that that's very hierarchical and not appropriate, but it kind of sounds like Japan a little bit. But if you...
Depends on what dimensions you're asking.
I know, of course.
But I would say, interestingly, Brazil usually comes out as the
Brazil?
winner when we're talking about the book.
I mean, Japan's just so good at food education. So it depends what you think school meals should be prioritizing. Japan's program is not universal free. Brazil's is.
Yes.
So there's like these different things that I think...
Yeah, it depends on what your concerns are, and I would say the value of the book, I hope people find within it, is that when you look across the different chapters and the essays that accompany them, is that you can find your particular community's concerns within it and potential ways that you can activate other members of your community to seek that change and help define the problem that you think the school food policy should be addressing. Yeah.
So for the fact that it's global in nature, I'll just say that part of why I was so excited when I got Sarah's email was that when I finished writing The Labor of Lunch, that book is entirely focused on the United States, and I felt like I had gotten to learn from some school districts around the country that were really at the kind of forefront of trying to transition their school food programs to really focus on fresh preparation, farm to school, culturally affirming meals, but that many of them were still really limited by what the national system is here. And so that got me really curious even before I think the pandemic in the United States, because it did make school meals, well, during the pandemic, the USDA issued these waivers that made school meals free for all for about 2 years. And so I think that accomplished some things politically in terms of creating space that people had been working for a long time, but didn't necessarily feel were like super politically feasible, but kind of supercharged that conversation. And I think all the while I had been really interested in looking at countries outside of the United States, like after I finished Labor of Lunch, because I really wanted to look at places that had, whether it be universal or universal free, school meal programs, meaning that it's something that's a common experience that all students are having together. Like it's treated as a public good, a shared public resource, something that people are doing in community with one another on a daily basis. So I was interested in these places that have universal programs, as well as places that were really intentionally using public procurement to support transitions to sustainable food systems. And so for me, like because we see kind of individual states or districts in the United States that are making change, I guess I was just really interested at that point in looking at other places that have large-scale national programs. So like we have, for example, India and Brazil. India is the largest free school lunch program in the world. And in that chapter, actually one of my graduate students who is from India, I worked with her on that chapter. It's a solo author chapter, but I asked her to do it and kind of supported her along the way because I knew that she had a really, really strong interest in the role of civil society, and that was really core to the story of what happened in India, in particular with their right to food movement and how much it was really something that was kind of pushed within this broader movement for securing human rights, so the human right to food and education in the Indian context. So I think that because sometimes it can feel like programs at the federal level in the United States are super stagnant, I really personally, as someone who works primarily in the US, wanted to look at other countries for inspiration and proof that, hey, we can actually do scratch preparation in like mega cities. They do it in Sao Paulo and Tokyo. It's not that weird to think we can do it in a city of 30,000. And I also just felt like being able to sort of point to some of these things that I think are really kind of best practices and like national scale programs just opens more space for us to think with here.
I am led back to the reason why I continued to pursue an academic career, and I'm from the United States. I grew up in Buffalo, just in case people didn't know that. And yet I had this idea that there was a really big world out there, and that there was potentially ways to learn to do things and to be in different ways that I could learn from beyond Buffalo, from beyond Western New York, and crossing the border into Canada, was one way, but not enough. And so I've dedicated my career to going to Latin America, looking at global examples to learn how different communities are doing things related to education policy, education work, and school food in different ways that we could potentially learn about and adapt for our communities here in the United States. And that shift and that idea that you could shift our gaze, the U.S. gaze, to looking abroad to learn from and to consume that knowledge and process it. It still really is a driving force in my own research, but also really I think we capture that in transforming school food politics really well. And I think we do that well because we do have these cases from the US that show how different ideas are being adapted and expanded at local as well as state levels. and different.
I mean, it pierces the inevitability, that this idea that this system is, of course, the only one we can have.
Yeah.
It really pierces that nicely. So I just have a final question, and then we can open it up to other folks. And this is just a more personal question in some ways. I wrote a book about recreation, and when you write a book about something that's related to childhood, people's emotions are very present in all sorts of ways, and of course it brings up a lot of memory. So I was just wondering about your own, like whether you brought any of your own memories of your own, experiences in school cafeterias. Like I remember trying to open that milk carton and how difficult it was. Whether that is behind any of this, or also your experience as parents as well. The personal bringing into this broader study.
Oh, very much so. It's totally woven across this whole project and the first book as well. And I actually haven't told this story but it's the story of my experience of school food in the United States. And I definitely have many stories from my own children attending BPS schools and school food experiences there. But for my own experience of attending Buffalo Public Schools, I was at the cusp of change that was happening in the United States and in Buffalo Public Schools in particular, where I could go home for my school meal.
Yep.
However, I lived kind of far from the school 60, Ontario Street in Riverside, but I could walk to my aunt and uncle and my grandmother's house. Not because in my working class family, there were full households of people. People were working. And so I had the opportunity to walk to my Uncle Chuck and Aunt Riri and grandmother's house. My Aunt Riri and grandmother were crossing guards, crossing us to go home for our school meal. But Uncle Chuck worked, I don't know, I think it's a second shift or he worked afternoons. And so he was around. He was home from his Dunlop shift and he was responsible for feeding me during those years before there was a transition to school meals being provided at School 60. And to me, the memories, so clear of that precious time, the walk home, seeing another relative as a crossing guard, and spending that time with my uncle, who was in his slides and drinking coffee and probably smoking a ciggy and serving me a meal at the table, and then going back to school to finish out the day. That was really special and significant to me as such a strong memory of the power of sharing a meal and being served, like being given care and given care with love. Yeah. And of course, along the way, I have children who have had very different experiences where I have prepared the meals and sent them with my children over the years, and having them come home with that same meal and say, well, it looked pretty good today, so I ate that meal. And more recently, having students within the Buffalo Public School system, a very segregated system where students are very disconnected, both from neighborhoods and other kids in their neighborhoods, but also are disconnected from schools across the district. And hearing from teachers I was working with about their concern that the food they were being provided at this one school that served a majority refugee and poor population was different from that school on the hill, we'll call it. And they were very dismayed and they told their teachers they thought they were being treated differently than those kids up there on the hill. And that school up on the hill serves a very different population than the rest of the Buffalo Public Schools. So I had students take pictures of their lunches across these different Buffalo Public Schools and share those pictures. And what they confirmed is they're all getting the same meal across the district. My hope is always that it would lead to that collectivization, like the students themselves would start having conversations that are really important and potentially create a groundswell of collaboration across the different schools in the district, but that'll be to be continued.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you want to speak to that at all, Jen?
Sure. I don't feel like my own personal experience really made it into this book in particular, but I do a lot of public scholarship and a lot of like community-based research and activism in Madison and Wisconsin. And I will say that there people often ask me about not necessarily my experience as a kid, but like if I'm a parent and if I have a kid and what I do. And I will say, I only have a 3.5-year-old, but one of the things that I love is that her school offers school lunch. And it's great. Like, I love not having to pack lunches. They started it when she was 1 year old, and I think it's amazing. I love it. But I think it's interesting that, like, I often will get that question as if I can't, as an expert on this topic, actually have a valid viewpoint without
unless you're
being
a
a
mother.
parent myself.
Yeah, very interesting. Talking about care work and
Yes.
feminism. Yes, absolutely. So I'm happy to open things up if people have questions or comments that they would like to pose. Unfortunately, yeah, go ahead.
I've got two points here. I'll introduce myself. I'm a first-year PhD student here at the University of Buffalo, and my interest is in educational policy, specifically looking at immigration. And so within the context of the whole conversation, I know that there was a discussion of ethnic food and then looking at grassroots movement. So how does the conversation, as we continue to see global diasporas or climate change forcing the movement of populations to different areas, how do you see maybe the foodways changing within the public sphere or reaction to not including that? And then my second question for you is looking at authorship within continental Africa. I was looking through the table of contents and I wanted to know if you had reached out to scholars there to see how they are dealing with this possibility to serve their communities.
Yeah.
I think the second question is a quick response in saying that.
Oh yeah.
Oh, sure.
So it was two questions, like how in this day and age of mass migratory movement of people, are schools and how is education policies related to school food actually changing as a result of that movement of students from different cultural communities and ethnic communities and nationalities? How are school food programs responding?
And then the second question was looking at the table of the contents for the book. The one continent that we don't have representation from is the continent of Africa, and just asking about that. So we mentioned this in the conclusion of the book, that was something that we had really hoped for. And when we were working on this book, there were two different sets of authors that we worked with that would have provided, I mean, certainly not a representation across like the entire African continent, which is really diverse, but at least a couple country contexts. And unfortunately, I think just because of the timing of when the book was being written, there were a lot of different things going on in people's lives, and those chapters got to a certain stage but never made it to the finish line. So I think that's something that we just acknowledge in the conclusion and try to invite others to kind of take up this additional exchange of information and knowledge. And I think that that's something that we're actually seeing more interesting documentation and case studies of from the Global School Meals Coalition. And one of the things that Sarah and I did actually with this volume, which I also did for Labor of Lunch, was to create a free, like publicly accessible reading guide that's chapter by chapter with different like discussion prompts and activities and further resources. So I think that in some of the further resources that we point to, there's some like good examples of material from African authors and African contexts, but unfortunately it's not something we have ourselves in this book. And then I'll start with that first question of saying that I think that we see really wide variation, and I'm going to speak just to the US context in terms of what I've seen, in terms of some school food operators being really proactive about looking at who their communities are and trying to be more culturally responsive in terms of what their menu items look like, and there's other places that don't do that at all. And so there's been a couple examples that I think are pretty compelling in places where there really hasn't been a good, effective response from the school food service department to really change things to meet the changing needs and demographics of their communities. I'll mention two. So one was an example in Colorado where a lot of Latina moms in particular were feeling like the school needed to serve more culturally relevant food. And so they organized themselves within this kind of network of moms to get more culturally relevant food for their kids. So that's something that I think we can see through different kinds of parent groups. I know when I was doing my fieldwork for the first book in St. Paul at the time in Minnesota, they actually had a community kind of process where different community members could submit recipes, and then the district would work to try to like scale them up. And so I remember seeing like pictures of Somali and other kind of major communities that they have there, like families actually coming into their central kitchen facility and like tasting things and giving feedback and stuff. But I think that some of those things like got scaled back during the pandemic when not only were some of the labor challenges and school meal programs like really exacerbated, but also there was much more of a shift in many places to prepackaged stuff that could be like easily distributed in classrooms and other kinds of environments. So I think it's something that the school nutrition community is really actively aware of, but how much an individual community is acting on it, I think can be somewhat dependent on not only the capacity that they have, but also some of the inertia and willingness to change that can come from within the district, but sometimes also you see these examples of like the Latina moms in Colorado who are exerting this pressure on the district to be responsive. And I'll end just with one example in Wisconsin where I am. In Milwaukee Public Schools, there's an organization called Voces de la Frontera, which is the main kind of immigrant rights organization in the state. And they have a youth arm called Youth Empowered in the Struggle. And some of the youth from that organization, when Milwaukee Public Schools first went back to in-person learning after the pandemic, they decided that they were, like good community organizers, going to do a survey and ask people what issues mattered to them. And it turned out that the thing that people were most concerned about in Milwaukee Public Schools was the quality of their school lunch. And so they launched a campaign for what they call school lunch justice. And one of their 6 demands was actually to have halal and kosher meals, like to make sure that they have things that are meeting the religious dietary needs of their classmates. So I think that there are examples that we see of people sort of standing up for those rights to food being not only accessible but also nourishing of people's identities.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to bring us to the Buffalo context too. So we do have in Buffalo Public School meals, halal meals are available. That really came about because of the tenacity of Drea Denur, who is an incredible singer, but also is a concerned mom of kids who go to BPS. And after starting a halal food bank, because she found that members of her community were not being served by the food banks around the area, just started her own. And that has really taken off and grown. But then she didn't stop there because she was learning more about food and nutrition, and was also concerned about what her 5 kids were eating at Buffalo Public Schools. And so she actually spearheaded, I'm going to say, with other community organizations, that change to now halal meals being provided to students in BPS schools. So in a way, we shouldn't have to rely on one mother who is organizing with others, but that is one particular example that's really positive and hopeful, and those changes continue in BPS to this day. The other one that I wanted to speak to was were the things that we still need to do. So I'm going to say I can't give you examples of it actually happening, but I think there's promising, hopeful opportunities that are on the horizon. The first is that there is a system of school gardens around Buffalo. Buffalo School Gardens. I used to be on the board. I'm not anymore. And they're a branch of Western New York Grassroots Gardens. And what we learned from working in those different gardens, I think we were up to 35 different gardens around the city at different schools, is that in particular, the refugee communities were actually schooling the people who were running those gardens. And what that means is that they were introducing new foods that could be grown in this environment and how they could be used, but also teaching the educators and gardeners who were working there with them about how to use all parts of a plant. I have this example that stands out in my mind where the garden manager would harvest the carrots, lop off the top, and throw them on the compost heap until one of the moms, through an interpreter, reminded him that that was food too, and then showed him how to use that as a nutritious food product that she was taking home, or a food item, ingredient, not product. But I think there's a lot to be learned from communities about the ways that we can and should be feeding students, that we still have a lot to learn on, and I think we're beginning that journey, at least here in Buffalo. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, I'm going back to your land acknowledgement and thinking about the fact that we're here on the lands of the Haudenosaunee people, and specifically the Seneca Nation. And you could, all of you, who hasn't heard of what the Three Sisters is? Does everyone know what the Three Sisters is? Okay, so the Three Sisters are the staple three food items that the Haudenosaunee people cultivate and live off of and have for millennia. And we teach that in our public schools, but we are not actually serving those in our school meals. Why not? Beans, squash, and corn. All things that can be grown here, all things that most of our kids have eaten, or if they haven't, should be introduced to as nourishing, fresh, locally sourced food items. So work to do on that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you both, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I had a question about perspective, and first thank you for all of your comments. It's just so interesting. So I did have a question about perspective, but first I wanted to make a comment that's also a sense of perspective, and that is, I have a friend from Kenya who's building a school in Tanzania.
Okay.
And it's in a rural area that serves very poor students from Tanzania and Kenya. And so if you're I mean, obviously Africa is an enormous continent with a lot of different economies. But a lot of places in Africa do not have schools to offer lunches. So it's just a very, very different scenario. So for them to build a school, they're literally with the help of the children, they're literally making the bricks to build the buildings in an area where the Tanzanian government says they will not be able to even think about building a school for at least another 10 years. And there's no community center or anything else. So as soon as they built the school, it also has become a community center that the members of the community asked if they could hold their meetings there. It can be incredibly transformative just to build, but it's like they're also creating the fields to grow their own food so that they can have food for the children. And Kwame Alexander, the poet, tells a story about being asked to give a poetry reading in Ghana and getting in a school in Ghana. And he got there and found the school has no building. The children have no desks. They have no books. All the teacher had is a blackboard on which she was drawing a picture of a laptop to teach them about computers. But it just, a sense of perspective. Also, I've spent a lot of time in Chautauqua County, which is even poorer than Erie County. And from teachers and activists children will not come to school because they don't have a winter coat. So a primary concern for a lot of teachers, the teachers have a big fundraising thing that they do every year to try to raise money to buy coats for the students. So that said, the question I have about perspective is, I just find it so frustrating when you mention this choice between increased pay for the workers or increase the quality and quantity of food in the school lunches. And I'm just thinking, is there any perspective in your book? Does anybody talk about, okay, the budget for schools compared to the Department of Defense, for example? Why does the wealthiest country on earth not have adequate money to feed our children? That's a rhetorical question, I know, but maybe.
And I think that's the heart of school food politics. I think we do have adequate money to do that, but it's a decision about where we're going to put that money. Do you want to respond?
Well, when you use the word adequate too, it reminded me of some of the school food fights literature.
Angie McKee Brown's stuff.
Angie McKee Brown's stuff. So Jen and I wrote an op-ed that appeared in The Guardian in a series called School Food Fights, School Food Fights. Yeah, and one of the contributors wrote about this idea that why is it that we're only expecting or striving for adequate food and really adequate care for our students in public schools. And that to me is kind of where the foundational question that we need to first ask each other about and what adequate actually looks like. We do not have a chapter that is from the U.S. that's talking about the differences in federal spending, federal dollars and distribution. So that was a quick answer for that. Not that it shouldn't be done or couldn't be done and be a very interesting and compelling answer, but I think we also kind of know that already. I mean, there's that poster that you see every once in a while around, and it says, when the Air Force has to hold a bake sale to purchase a new fighter jet versus, the school music program or, the cafeteria or something. Yeah. So it really comes down to, the questions of politics. It just seems like such a nonsensical thing, too, when we think about the importance that schools play in our community and still do, that we wouldn't be valuing them both in terms of dollars but also in terms of morals.
I wonder too if there's a class dimension here, and you know, I'm thinking about that moment when Jamie Oliver flew over to the U.S. to reform our school food system, and he kind of came in with arugula and I think they call it rocket, but whatever. But there was this class dimension where he was very scornful of the cafeteria workers and of the children because, obesity epidemic, et cetera, et cetera. And you're talking about public schools. So, where do you invest? Do you invest in these working class, sometimes rural communities where there's a lot of kind of criticism about obesity and so forth, but a certain amount of blame the victim, I guess, is what I'm thinking. Yeah.
I mean, and yet we know that obesity is rising in the United States and will continue to rise both in terms of adolescents, youth, and adults, and that's not going to change in the near future. It's definitely going up and predicted to go up. But I think that's the trickier part about the U.S. case is that we actually have such a broken food system, and we export it really well around the world, and it's been really disheartening to watch that throughout the Americas as I see this embracing of burgers, for example, in Argentina, where if a decade ago we wouldn't be eating burgers, that wasn't something we ate, and French fries, we would be eating a salad, and we would be eating vegetables with it, and we would be eating a piece of steak, but we would be eating a different type of food. But now it's very trendy.
Interesting.
And kind of displacing a little bit of that particular food system. And this is definitely the case throughout other Latin American nations. And now what we see happening is that they're dealing with the double burden of nutrition, which is that you have both undernourished and malnourished people and students in our schools. So how do we actually change the school meal program? There are many bans throughout the Americas on ultra-processed food being sold or served to students. However, what we also know from that is that you can have that policy on the books, but that doesn't mean that those ultra-processed foods aren't suddenly transformed into nourishing and having high dietary content, or its packaging changes quickly.
Right.
So it is a real struggle, which is also why it's really important for a broader base of people to really understand that they can and should do policy. And I would say this has also been this has been really central to my own research as an ed policy researcher. And it all starts again with the Argentinian teachers who I would start interviewing, and I would say, tell me about education policy and how it affects your work. And they would say, I don't do policy, I don't know policy, but, and then 2 or 3 hours later, they would stop talking, because of course they do policy. Right. Of course, all of us do policy in our everyday lives. We just don't think of ourselves as actors in public policy. So I would, going back to the intro to the book, we lay out something we call policy protagonism, which really came from me learning from the teachers, and from US teachers as well as Argentinian teachers and many in between, about first taking the opportunity, taking responsibility and taking the power to define the problem that public policy should be addressing, and then seeking who has those resources, who to address that problem, and then also using your role from within society. You don't have to make something up. And Drea Denor was a mother, and she just expected and wanted something different for her children at school, and so she leveraged that position and got the change within the Buffalo Public School system. And then lastly, you're never doing that alone. And I keep saying her name, but she worked with many others who have been involved in this school food change happening in Buffalo, but also in the broader local food systems change that, like, for example, Dr. Samina Raja has been working on for decades, and bringing people together and different groups together to make that change happen.
We have time for one more if somebody, yes.
Yeah. So I guess for youth, I mean, it's for everybody in a lot of different contexts, but for youth, food can be a pretty sensitive subject.
Yeah, that's a good point, for sure.
So I guess I'm thinking with for those that where school lunches are an absolute necessity, you could possibly think that food at home for them is a real emotional issue, perhaps, and that could be any context. But I'm just wondering if there's movements or just ways that are concerned with getting a pulse on the youth's perspective of school lunch, and how that relates to them emotionally, and that could be concerning eating disorders or anything along those lines. If that makes sense.
It does a little bit, and so the question was how that to acknowledge that meals and school meals in particular tap into an emotionality that potentially could or should or maybe isn't being acknowledged and tapped into in productive ways, so that youth are engaged, or that a particular experience is acknowledged and used by them to demand change. I just wanted to put a shout out to a scholar here at UB in the Graduate School of Education, Brittany Jones, who is a social studies educator and education scholar, and she's been writing about emotionality in relation to school curriculum, and I've just started tapping into her work and thinking about it in terms of how it can reinforce and buttress and needs to be a very crucial component of any kind of care work and demands for change around care work that we're doing. So that was the first thing. But then I'm thinking about how the emotions of Argentinian youth who actually drove them to mass national protest and shutting down major thoroughfares in the capital city of Buenos Aires. And they did that specifically because of emotions they felt about how they were being fed at school and how the workers at their schools were being treated as well. And then they became even more emotionally charged when they were guided by educators to learn about the school meal procurement process for the nation and how those particular contracts went to national food corporations, and they were not, there was no necessarily stopgap or check, there's no checks and balances. And so in many cases, those same corporations are being given the contracts year after year, but they're not even feeding the students. Or if they're feeding the students, they're feeding them food that is rotten. And so we begin actually the book with a description of that and some links to learning more about the work that they did. And you definitely, they harness the emotions that gave to them, but they also harness the emotions of the society and in their demand for change.
Do we have time for me to make a brief
Sure,
response?
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I would say that in the United States, right now with the conversation about universal free school meals, one of the number one things that people are really talking about is reducing the experience of people feeling stigmatized by eating school meals. And I think that there's been some really great research that I've seen in both the US and Canadian context that looks at, in particular, how young people feel about, for example, if they are sent to school with like what may be a normal food for them to eat at home, but is not like, you know, quote unquote American food or Canadian food, and like that can be a really hurtful experience for them, like not being able to eat like food that feels like normal and comforting to them, like in that communal space. And so that is one of the things that I think our school meal programs have the potential to do, is to not only be culturally relevant but culturally affirming, that all these diverse cultures, to go back to the earlier comment, are part of what belongs, you know, in our schools and in our national, like, you know, foodways. And I think one example that I'll also point to, I chair the Ag, Food, and Human Values student paper competition, and the paper that won last year was from a geographer from the University of Oregon, Samantha Brown, and she was writing about school meals in Denmark and about how like that country has had, in particular, a lot of Muslim immigrants coming in, and pork meatballs are like a really significant thing, I guess, in their school meals. So she looks at these like different kinds of like identity politics and challenges and emotional feelings of not only students but also of like the population at large through the lens of some of these debates about like meatballs on the school menu. So I think that there is some scholarship on this, but I think it kind of cuts across like both this question of access to school meals and like who would be sort of feeling othered or not based on whether they're eating like the government subsidized meal, but then also like the actual sort of like material substance of what it is that kids may be eating at school. I think can be another place for either division or commonality and like positive or negative emotion.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think we can wind it up there. Thank you so much. Round of applause, please, for our co-authors.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Ta-da.
Thanks for